Hello there, celestial citizens. Welcome to Mads the Ghost. My name is Mads. Tonight I'm here to help you understand Gothic literature. I'm pretty sure by now you've already realized that I am myself a goth. Not completely black and white, but definitely a goth. I'm an avid lover of goth music, goth fashion, goth makeup, everything to do with the subculture. I love it, even though today I'm wearing an Ozzy shirt, but we're just going to ignore that for right now. Although I love the typical aspects of the goth subculture, I am also a huge lover of Gothic literature, and I think it's due for a revival. Before we delve into specific books, though, I'm going to take a minute to explain to you what Gothic literature is, because the whole purpose of this series on my channel is going to be helping people understand different works of Gothic literature in an effort to try to get people who maybe didn't have any interest in it before to be interested in it, and hopefully by enjoying the old novels and pieces of Gothic literature, it will encourage people to revive it and start writing some of their own. Gothic literature is a child genre of the Romantic era of literature. The Romantic era emphasized artistic freedom in writing as well as expression of emotion and heavy emphasis on nature. A good example of a Romantic era piece is My Heart Leaps Up by Wordsworth, in which he expresses immense joy over seeing a rainbow. He expresses that the rainbow made him so overwhelmed with happiness that he was reminded of the importance of how childhood experiences shape us as adults. Another real-life example for myself is the fact that in college I was frequently told by my creative writing professor that I was a modern-day romantic poet because in all of my assignments I managed to somehow use the moon and other celestial bodies to express the emotions that I was trying to convey in the piece. Gothic literature is a form of creative writing that employs heavy emphasis on horror, frightening imagery, some element of mystery, the supernatural in some capacity, heavy emotion, and very well thought out settings. The landscapes and interior building settings, along with the immense emotions written into the characters, are where the Romantic era writing shines through in Gothic literature. If you need to break it down further, you could say that Gothic literature is a creepy cousin of Romantic literature. They are extremely similar, but they have just enough variations between the two genres to make them different. Now that you understand what Gothic literature is a little bit better, I'm going to be spending the next few videos reading the story The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. I'll be reading short segments at a time and breaking them down in little bite-sized pieces that everyone can understand. And something before we get into the story as a whole that I want to bring up first, though, is 1. Literature is art. Art is subjective. Nobody but the author of a piece of Gothic literature truly understands what their intent was when they were writing it. Everything is speculation, which means that everything I'm going to be explaining to you comes from the way I interpret these stories and the way I was taught to interpret them by various people in my own life. You may have a different interpretation. That doesn't mean that I'm wrong, and that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means that we see in a different way, and I heavily encourage friendly conversation about different meanings that you might see in the story that maybe I didn't see. The other thing I want to bring up is the fact that what I just explained to you as far as what Gothic literature is a very Spark Notes type version of it, and I strongly encourage you to do some more private research by yourself if you want to learn more about what the Gothic literature movement was, why it was inspired, why it was created, and that whole rabbit hole. Otherwise, we would spend an entire video just discussing that. So, now that all of that's out of the way, it's time to get into the story. Sorry if I look down a lot. I'm using my laptop to read the story, but I'll be looking up as I explain things. So, on we go into chapter 1. Manfred, Prince of Otranto, had one son and one daughter. The latter, a most beautiful virgin, aged 18, was called Matilda. Conrad, the son, was 3 years younger, a homely youth, sickly and of no promising disposition, yet he was the darling of his father, who never showed any symptoms of affection to Matilda. Matilda had contracted a marriage for his son with the Marquis of Vicenza's daughter, Isabella, and she had already been delivered by her guardians into the hands of Manfred that he might celebrate the wedding as soon as Conrad's infirm state of health would permit. So already in the opening paragraph, we have a lot to unpack. The author, by means of mostly just explaining the physical nature of both children, has already described to us in vivid detail how their father feels about each of them. Although we hear that Matilda is so drop-dead gorgeous that all she had to do was walk down the street pretty much and people would probably be turning their heads left and right, she is still essentially worthless. She's basically no better than sheep being sold off at market, whereas his son, who is nothing to look at, would probably not have as much luck finding a wife all on his own, who's very sickly, so he wouldn't also be in much of a good position to provide for a family. He is automatically the chosen child, the one who gets all the good things from the father. So that already tells us a lot about where this story is going to be progressing as far as how these two people are seen. Manfred's impatience for the ceremonial was remarked by his family and neighbors. The former, indeed, apprehending the severity of their prince's disposition, did not dare to utter their surmises of this precipitation. Hippolyta, his wife, an amiable lady, did sometimes venture to represent the danger of marrying their only son so early, considering his great youth and greater infirmities, but she never received any other answer than reflections of her own sterility, who had given him but one heir. His tenants and subjects were less cautious in their discourses. They attributed this hasty wedding to the prince's dread of seeing accomplished an ancient prophecy, which was said to have pronounced that the castle and lordship of Otranto should pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. It was difficult to make any sense of this prophecy, and still less easy to conceive what it had to do with the marriage in question. Yet these mysteries or contradictions did not make the populace adhere the less to their opinion. So again, he managed to pack so much into single paragraphs. So now we're in the second paragraph and we understand a little bit more why in the world he's rushing his son, who is, by the author's own admission, not exactly the prize-winning pig here, off to get married, whereas the daughter, who again has a better chance at finding a husband and potentially making money and stuff, why is she's kind of thrown to the wayside? His son is his only heir. The fact that every time his mother tries to say, well, listen, he's sickly, he's never doing well, he's infirmed, he may never be able to do anything you're expecting of him in this marriage, why in the world are you doing this? All that the father has to say about that is, well, you're barren. After you gave me one single son, you didn't give me anything else to work with here, so off he goes. Hopefully he'll do everything that I expect in terms of carrying on my family name, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because if he is as direly sick as his mother is claiming that he is, you would think that, yeah, he's going to get married, but how long will he even be alive for? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Whereas if he married off his daughter to a rich prince or something, you could have an allyship with another nation. You could have her become very wealthy and send money back to his own kingdom. It's kind of funny how boxed in his thought process is, but you're already seeing these heavy emotions this early in the story, where you have the wife who is just worrying away in her corner about what her husband's doing to her children. You've got the husband trying to frantically get his son married so he can carry on the family name and give more heirs. And then you've got the son who so far seems like his reasons for getting married are completely different from his father's. He's not so much worried about carrying on the family name just, in general like that. He seems more like he's doing it out of superstition. So we'll see where it goes from here. Young Conrad's birthday was fixed for his espousals. The company was assembled in the chapel of the castle and everything ready for beginning the divine office when Conrad himself was missing. Manfred, impatient of the least delay, and who had not observed his son retire, dispatched one of his attendants to summon the young prince. The servant, who had not stayed long enough to have crossed the court to Conrad's apartment, came running back breathless in a frantic manner, his eyes staring and foaming at the mouth. He said nothing, but pointed to the court. The company were struck with terror and amazement. The Princess Hippolyta, without knowing what was the matter, but anxious for her son, swooned away. Manfred, less apprehensive than enraged at the procrastination of the nuptials, and at the folly of his domestic, asked imperiously what was the matter. The fellow made no answer, but continued pointing towards the courtyard, and at last, after repeated questions put to him, cried out, "Oh, the helmet, the helmet!" In the meantime, some of the company had run into the court, from whence was heard the confused noise of shrieks, horror, and surprise. Manfred, who began to be alarmed at not seeing his son, went himself to get information on what occasioned this strange confusion. Matilda remained endeavoring to assist her mother, and Isabella stayed for the same purpose. So again, that was actually 3 very short burst paragraphs, but it tells us a ton. So we're waiting for the wedding to start. Son is nowhere to be seen. Dad's getting really cheesed about it. And everyone else is just kind of chilling basically and trying to keep Manfred from getting pissed off even further. And when Manfred has one of his servants go to look for where Conrad has gone, apparently no one still knows where this guy is. He's just completely vanished off the face of the planet. But whatever it is that this servant saw in the courtyard is so horrific that he can't even talk about it. He's basically gone into full shock and is even, foaming at the mouth and stuff, so even worse than shock. And this is where some of that Gothic literature comes in. We saw a little tiny hint of romanticism so far, not too much yet. We've seen some high emotions already at the beginning of this story. We haven't seen too much yet in terms of the setting, which I'm sure will come, and we haven't seen too much yet in terms of nature coming into play. But we've seen the high emotions, and now the Gothic elements are coming in terms of the terror. I mean, think about, putting yourself in the place of anyone at this wedding party who's just innocently waiting for this guy to come back and get married, and all of a sudden the servant who you think is going to go, oh yeah, he's just out here smelling flowers or something and wasting time, comes bolting in and just having a complete freak out on the floor in front of you. That would be absolutely terrifying. And where the Romantic era writers would have put more emphasis on maybe what the courtyard looked like, what nature was there, and what that nature was evoking to the servant at the time or to Conrad at the time, we put that emphasis instead into what the servant looked like. That is the most vivid imagery we've seen so far, even, compared to the son and daughter so far. I mean, we heard that Matilda is beautiful and we heard that Conrad is very plain, but that's still, those are very vague descriptors. I mean, any of us could get any number of images in our head based on those descriptors, whereas this servant, although we don't know necessarily what he looks like in his day-to-day life, we know exactly what he looked like when he saw whatever it is he saw, the helmet. It's also very interesting to hear that Isabella is actually not that interested in marrying Conrad. Now, we know that Manfred is in a rush to get Conrad married to kind of complete his family line, but what's interesting is we haven't heard Isabella's side of this. Why, if she has no interest in marrying him, and Manfred is kind of this nasty guy, would she be agreeing to this, or did she not get to agree to it? The first thing that struck Manfred's eyes was a group of his servants endeavoring to raise something that appeared to him a mountain of sable plumes. He gazed without believing his sight. "What are ye doing?" cried Manfred wrathfully. "Where is my son?" A volley of voices replied, "Oh, my lord, the prince, the helmet, the helmet." Shocked with these lamentable sounds and dreading he knew not what, he advanced hastily. But what a sight for the father's eyes! He beheld his child dashed to pieces and almost buried under an enormous helmet, 100 times more large than any casque ever made for human being, and shaded with a proportionable quantity of black feathers. That escalated quickly. The horror of the spectacle, the ignorance of all around how this misfortune had happened, and above all, the tremendous phenomenon before him took away the prince's speech. Yet his silence lasted longer than even grief could occasion. He fixed his eyes on what he wished in vain to believe a vision, and seemed less attentive to his loss than buried in meditation on the stupendous object that had occasioned it. He examined the fatal casque, nor could even the bleeding, mangled remains of the young prince divert the eyes of Manfred from the portent before him. So that explains now why the servant kind of wigged out on everybody and was screaming, "The helmet, the helmet." So now we have two elements of Gothic literature that have entered the story. We have heavy emphasis on vividly describing the horror elements. First we had the freak out of the servant and how creepy that looked. Now we have the absolute brutal, horrific violence that is the death of Conrad. And this is where things became more shocking when Gothic literature came into play versus Romantic, because although Romantic wasn't always positive writing, it's called Romantic for a reason, not necessarily like in the kissy kissy smoochy smoochy sense of the word or anything, but it's beautiful. Whereas now there is this grotesquerie. I mean, we're explaining that he is a just mangled corpse now that is barely recognizable as ever having been a human being in the first place. And you can only imagine what people back when the story was written were thinking, reading something like that. And on top of it, not only do we have the grotesque imagery and the terror imagery, now we're incorporating the mystery element of Gothic literature. The mystery being, why in the world is there a giant helmet with black feathers popping out of it, and how the hell did it kill this guy? All who had known his partial fondness for young Conrad were as much surprised at their prince's insensibility as thunderstruck themselves at the miracle of the helmet. They conveyed the disfigured corpse into the hall without receiving the least direction from Manfred. As little was he attentive to the ladies who remained in the chapel. On the contrary, without mentioning the unhappy princess, his wife and daughter, the first sounds that dropped from Manfred's lips were, "Take care of Lady Isabella." So now, again, in that brief paragraph, we've seen how Manfred has reacted to the death of his son and finding his remains. And it's interesting seeing how his relationship with his family works. Rather than rushing to his wife and his daughter and being like, your son and your brother, he's gone. We don't know what happened. It's really strange, mysterious circumstances. We need to, go and get a constable to help us or something. He just brushes past them like they don't even exist and says, "Take care of the girl who was going to marry my son that I know basically nothing about," which shows you just how little he cares for his own family, that he cared more about someone who is effectively a stranger than their own well-being, and they're basically going to find out that Conrad is dead through someone they barely know. The domestics, without observing the singularity of this direction, were guided by their affection to their mistress to consider it as particularly addressed to her situation, and flew to her assistant. They conveyed her to the chamber more dead than alive, and indifferent to all the strange circumstances she heard, except the death of her son. Matilda, who doted on her mother, smothered her own grief and amazement, and thought of nothing but assisting and comforting her afflicted parent. Isabella, who had been treated by Hippolyta like a daughter, and who returned that tenderness with equal duty and affection, was scarce less assiduous about the princess, at the same time endeavoring to partake and lessen the weight of the sorrow which she saw Matilda strove to suppress, for whom she had conceived the warmest sympathy of friendship. Yet her own situation could not help finding its place in her thoughts. She felt no concern for the death of young Conrad except commiseration, and she was not sorry to be delivered from a marriage which had promised her little felicity, either from her destined bridegroom or from the severe temper of Manfred, who, though he had distinguished her by great indulgence, had imprinted her mind with terror from the causeless rigor to such amiable princesses as Hippolyta and Matilda. Once again, we're getting a lot more backstory as to how this dynamic worked. So it makes sense that Isabella wants to stick around after all this when she could have just taken off and been like, screw this family, this is too much for me, and who could have blamed her if she had done that? Instead, she's sticking around because she feels that Matilda is basically like her best friend. She really cared about her. She saw her as a sister. She sees Hippolyta almost as her mother because of how she's treated her. You haven't heard anything about Isabella's own family yet, which is interesting, but now we understand why she's inclined to stick around when something this terrifying is going on. But it's also interesting seeing that she doesn't really care that Conrad is dead. She absolutely didn't want to marry him, to the extent that finding out he's died this way is almost a relief to her. And on top of that, she is fixating more on the fact that she doesn't have to be part of a family that Manfred is the head of, because as she describes him, he is terrifying. And although we've seen him be kind of a dick so far, we haven't actually seen him do anything that could constitute someone finding him terrifying. So it's going to be interesting to see if there's either more backstory or just in some way more explanation on what he's done to make her feel that way, because you have her in one breath saying, oh, he lavishes me with all these gifts and stuff, and like materialistically treats me like a princess, but he's also a really scary guy. While the ladies were conveying the wretched mother to her bed, Manfred remained in the court, gazing on the ominous cask, and regardless of the crowd which the strangeness of the event had now assembled around him. The few words he articulated tended solely to inquiries whether any man knew from whence it could have come. Nobody could give him the least information. However, as it seemed to be the sole object of his curiosity, it soon became so to the rest of the spectators, whose conjectures were as absurd and improbable as the catastrophe itself was unprecedented. In the midst of their senseless guesses, a young peasant, whom rumor had drawn thither from the neighboring village, observed that the miraculous helmet was exactly like that of a figure in black marble of Alfonso the Good, one of their former princes in the Church of St. Nicholas. So this is a really cool way that he's expressing the passage of time. We haven't left the night of the incident yet, but obviously several hours must have passed if by this point the women are all retiring to bed together, and someone from a neighboring village has found out about what occurred at the castle courtyard. It's also interesting that Manfred is not mourning in the way that you typically would. Instead, he's almost become the detective of his own case. He's saying nothing, it says, apart from asking people questions. And with this entire castle full of guests for the wedding, somehow no one saw anything, no one noticed anything. The only person who has information is this random peasant from another village who says that the giant helmet that has fallen and crushed him is from this enormous statue of an old prince. And that's already very interesting and adds even more layers to the mystery, because it's like, okay, what's the significance of the fact that it was specifically a statue of a prince? It could have been a captain, some kind of soldier, it could have been a king, it could have been a priest, it could have been a statue of anyone, but it was specifically a statue of an old prince. Was this prince a good and kind and just prince who is not happy with the way Manfred is running this kingdom now? Was he an angry and malevolent prince and he's just enjoying inflicting pain? What is it about this prince in particular that needed to have so much attention drawn to him? And on top of that, okay, now we know that the helmet came from the statue of the prince, but how did it fall? Typically, helmets are affixed to the statue. A statue is basically a part of one whole, not a bunch of different parts. And even if, devil's advocate here, the helmet was not attached to the statue of the prince, it was just kind of resting on top of his head, he would have been pretty high up. For the helmet to have fallen off and completely obliterated Conrad, it would have had to have fallen from pretty high up in the sky. So is this a supernatural act? Is it the ghost of the prince purposefully killing him? Did somebody climb up the statue and chuck it down? Maybe someone from, the princess's family or something? We're adding more and more layers to this mystery, and mystery is always a very important part of Gothic literature. And that's actually where we're going to leave this segment for tonight. I hope everyone is enjoying this, and I hope that I'm making it make a little more sense and that you're coming to love Gothic literature as much as I do. I'm going to continuously go through one book at a time because I don't want to completely overwhelm people with trying to keep up with like 3 stories at once. So after this video, we'll have a little discussion, and after that we'll also go into, the next piece and the next piece. But until next time, do something that makes you happy today, no matter what anyone else thinks about it, and I'll see all of you again soon. Thank you for coming.